So it seems like everybody is settled. Our next presenter is Jordan LaBouff. Jordan has a dual appointment in psychology and honors at the University of Maine. He is also an avid roller derby participant. So if you see someone skating up and down the streets of Austin, probably 6th Street, or the people tonight, that'll be Jordan in this moment.
Thanks, Wade. Yeah, and if you're in town through Saturday the 22nd, the Texas Roller Wheels have a bout here at the convention center. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to the organizers. I look forward to this every year, and I appreciate being invited to chat this year. I'd also like to take a second to thank people that this work really builds upon. You're going to hear from some of them a little bit later, I think. But many of you are probably familiar with Will, Azim, and Ara's work looking at sort of this social evolutionary model for looking at intergroup bias towards atheists. And this is going to build a lot upon some of that work, and I'll skip over a little bit of it because I think Will's going to talk about that work later, and I don't want to give half of his talk. This also is informed by a pair of recent undergraduates, Annie Ledoux and Charles Bergeron, that have now graduated and are working on this with me as they're finishing and working on graduate degrees and other things, who, after reading the recent work by these folks, really sort of drugged me in this direction, and it's really been an interesting endeavor for me. So this is really some new data, and what we're going to do is talk a little bit about what the underpinnings of these anti-atheist attitudes are, and try to look for ways in which we can target through manipulations ways to reduce that stigma and prejudice in particular ways. But before we do that, let's talk just a little bit about the group. I frankly was pretty surprised. I think it was at SPSP in Albuquerque many years ago. I heard Azim give a talk about atheism and prejudice towards atheism. He referenced this Edgell paper that many of you are probably familiar with, demonstrating that atheists are pretty universally maligned and distrusted, especially in this particular instance. Many of you have probably seen this figure that atheists, among other historically maligned and distrusted groups, are the one that people are least willing to vote for president or other sorts of positions of power. And that sort of surprised me, and I was further intrigued by Will's work and others demonstrating that this appears to be motivated by distrust. And the argument that they make is that because atheists are outside of the purview of some supernatural watcher, that they're less likely to engage in these social cooperative behaviors and thus are outside of our realm of trust. And this is just one of many examples that they provide, but in this particular example, people were less willing to hire an atheist into a high trust occupation, like a daycare worker, but were perfectly willing to hire this person into a relatively low trust occupation, like a waitress or waiter. This is particularly interesting to me because atheists, as far as intergroup bias is concerned, are fairly unique. Like some groups, their membership is concealable. Right? So we have this universally or largely distrusted group, but we can't identify them unless they reveal themselves to us. Right? But can you spot the atheist here? You're probably all right. This actually is one of the very rare collections of atheists. This is the Sunday Assembly. Many of you might have heard of this. It started a couple of months ago in the UK, where people are sort of congregating in atheist, what they prefer to call a pseudo-church, I think they say, where they're coming together for some atheist in-group identity, but this is quite rare, right? So not only are atheists concealable, as many religious group members are, they're also not cohesive. Right? They're a group that is identified instead of by some belief, behavior, or attitude, by the absence of that otherwise ubiquitous belief. And so they're not cohesive. They're also not identified by some particular quality. And so like other groups, the only thing that makes someone an atheist is not believing in this ubiquitous belief. So other than that one negative quality, they're infinitely variable. So we have this group that people distrust, and they're stigmatized, they're not identifiable, they're not cohesive, they're defined by this lack of equality, but I was interested in sort of the nuances of expression of prejudice towards atheists. I don't hear a lot of overt prejudice towards atheists in Maine. It's one of the least religious states in the nation. So Annie Ledoux and I asked 150 participants as part of a Mechanical Turk study to spend 3 minutes thinking about atheists, and then to spend the next 3 minutes writing about what they thought. So I just collected a few of those responses here. So for those people, there is no logical basis for objective morality or ultimate meaning and purpose. I immediately get disgusted and angry. They confuse me. They're troublemakers. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. They're worthless. And finally, they're foolish. They cannot be trusted. They do not have souls. They cannot be trusted. I appreciated the repetition here, given this hypothesis. I actually asked my research assistants if any of them maybe filled that out. But so this, and obviously these are, I've selected specifically, some of the more extreme responses. Many of the respondents were atheists or agnostics themselves and had very positive or neutral responses. But this prejudice exists, and people, at least under veiled anonymity, are willing to express it pretty directly. And so this sort of initial data really surprised me. I wanted to look into it a little bit more carefully. In previous work by Megan Shen, Wade Rowett, myself, and some other colleagues, we've looked at religious intergroup bias in light of the contributions of right-wing authoritarianism and fundamentalism specifically. And I'll gloss over a lot of the theoretical nuance, but there's a recent chapter in Policing and Clark's New Handbook edition that gives a lot of this theoretical background. And there's a new paper in Personality and Individual Differences by Shen and colleagues looking at the post-critical belief scale in this sort of model as well, if you're interested in that. So the oversimplified version is that authoritarianism tends to mediate the relationship between religiousness and racial or material sort of security types of threats, whereas fundamentalism tends to mediate the relationship between religiousness and value, moral, or worldview types of threats. So these different kinds of beliefs address or respond or are sensitive to different kinds of threats. So where hardline authoritarians who endorse authoritarian aggression and submission to authority, sort of this rightness of power, is sensitive to these material or structural threats, whereas the rightness of belief, fundamentalism, is more sensitive to these moral threats. And the studies that I mentioned previously and some others represent atheists as this value moral threat, right? They're a worldview threat, not so much a safety and security kind of threat. So the question for me is, to what extent does this social evolutionary model that argues that atheist prejudice should be motivated primarily by distrust, and this model, looking at the influence of fundamentalism and religious rigidity, to what extent do they interact and work together? The evolutionary model actually provides some of the data supporting the evolutionary model provides some support here as well. In this particular study, Will and others also tested the role of authoritarianism here. And what they found is that authoritarianism in this case was not a predictor of this discriminatory behavior, rather just belief in God was. So we wouldn't expect that, right? Authoritarianism shouldn't have a direct influence in this case on atheist discrimination, but we would expect it for fundamentalism, and in this study that wasn't measured. So what we're going to do in these following studies is take a look at how fundamentalism plays into this relationship between atheist prejudice, distrust, and other sorts of things. One of the students was also really interested in Todd Patinsky's idea that positive attitudes towards groups and negative attitudes towards groups are not necessarily two sides of the exact same continuum. Rather, that positive attitudes towards groups are particularly interesting when looking at ways to increase intergroup cooperativity, because they focus on some of these kinds of subscales like comfort with the group or willing to engage with the group. So these kinds of things promote intergroup contact or willingness to engage in intergroup contact, which we know can promote more intergroup engagement. So what we're interested in is not just the extent to which distrust and fundamentalism are responsible for negative attitudes, but rather the extent to which distrust and fundamentalism are responsible for positive attitudes as well, and willingness to engage with the group. And we're going to see to what extent we can push each of those things around a little bit. So the first thing that we did to investigate this role of fundamentalism and distrust in atheist prejudice and allophilia was we recruited 95 students from the University of Maine. This sample was pretty typical for University of Maine students. We are the whitest state in the nation. And so we had more than 90% Caucasians are at 19 years old and moderately religious, just above the midpoint. Primarily Christian, but large portions of unaffiliated students who identify as agnostic, largely about 27% of the sample. And there were, 16% atheists, and they were cut from the analysis. So the final sample was 95 students. The first thing I want to show you here is, I hope you can read that, is a hierarchical linear regression that demonstrates in step one, we're predicting, in this case, atheist anxiety. So this is an adaptation of Stefan and Stefan's 85 measure, looking at sort of willingness to engage or anxiety with engaging in a member of this outgroup. So in the first step, religiousness is associated with atheist anxiety. In the second step, we enter authoritarianism, fundamentalism, and as that previous model suggested, we find that fundamentalism is the critical component for predicting anxiety towards atheists, and this is a pretty consistent finding. But here, in the last model, we've included this measure of distrust. It's a single-item measure, just asking to what extent do you distrust atheists, or trust versus distrust, a semantic differential. And what we're finding here is that fundamentalism and distrust are both unique predictors. That is, they both explain unique variability in this anti-atheist attitudes, atheist anxiety measure. Interestingly, there was no interaction between distrust and fundamentalism. So you can see here on the y-axis there you've got centered anxiety, and you can see that there's a main effect for both fundamentalism, such that those who are high fundamentalist, whether they were low or high in distrust, had greater levels of anti-atheist or atheist anxiety, but those in the high distrust condition, whether they were fundamentalist or not, had more anxiety towards atheists. But we're also, as I mentioned, interested in the more positive attitudes. We used Todd Platinsky's measure of allophilia adapted for atheists, and we find a similar pattern. In this case, if anything, the pattern is a little bit stronger, such that in the first step, religion, again, is predicting more positive attitudes, or rather negatively, less positive attitudes towards atheists. When we include fundamentalism in the model, it's the critical component, and then we get the exact same pattern here, where both distrust and fundamentalism are associated with these more positive attitudes as well. And if you break it into each individual subscale, what you see is the strongest relationships are for comfort and engagement, and I'll get into that more in a little bit. Not so much in kinship. They still don't feel kin to atheists, but they're willing to engage in this case with lower levels of distrust in particular. And again, there was no interaction. That interaction is not significant between these two. So if you look at allophilia on the y-axis there, what you see is those higher in fundamentalism have lower levels of allophilia towards atheists, lower willingness to engage, also if they are high distrust. So you can see, again, distrust has the big component here, but fundamentalism is still critical. What's interesting to me about this is as I approach this from the perspective of how do we sort of reduce the impact of the stigma, we know that fundamentalism as a worldview is not particularly changeable, right? It's not only is it not particularly changeable, but maybe not be moral to do so, right? So, but distrust is an intergroup attitude, an interpersonal attitude, which may be more malleable. So if both of these things are contributing, where we should target the intervention might be more in distrust, not in these more broader worldview kinds of characteristics. And so, building on some work that, again, that student Charles Bertrand turned me on to, we started to look at ways in which we might reduce distrust. And obviously, one of the easiest and most well-studied ways is through intergroup contact. Right? It turns out that having positive intergroup interactions promotes future positive intergroup interactions, but intergroup contact is hard. It's particularly difficult in Maine where I can't find any atheists, and when we do have them, putting those people into a situation where we say, okay, you're an atheist, okay, you're a fundamentalist, now talk. Not always the most productive conversation. It's not always, because we know that these interactions need to be positive, right? They need to be cooperative and positive. So what we know is that when we can get people to switch groups, we can get them integrated like this, we see some pretty big benefits. We can reduce out-group hostility, and we can improve those intergroup attitudes. And this has been demonstrated in a variety of different groups and all kinds of different contact. But the problem, of course, is that groups tend to be pretty highly segregated. In this case, ideologically segregated, not so much physically or socially, and they're also concealed. So it's very difficult to engage in this kind of direct contact. There's also very little motivation to interact, particularly among the groups who have the most room to move. They have no interest in those kinds of interactions. I had some very interesting conversation. My family's from central Oklahoma, and I had some very interesting conversation with them about this talk, and I was talking to them this week, and I would say, oh, I'm talking about stigma towards atheists, and they would say, oh, I know one, my cousin's uncle's brother, is sort of distant. They don't recognize that they're in this context with these people very frequently. So to overcome this problem, one way to overcome this problem is through imagined intergroup contact. And I'll admit, sitting where you were when I first heard about this idea, I thought there is no way this is going to work. That just the mental simulation of a positive social interaction with at least one member of an outgroup is pretty powerful and demonstrably effective at reducing outgroup bias, at reducing intergroup anxiety, and producing more positive perceptions of the outgroup. This is largely work by Crispin Turner and Hodson and a few other people. This work has demonstrated effectiveness largely with racial groups, but also we've done some stuff recently with intergroup bias towards Muslims, that imagined interactions with Muslims, although the imagined interactions they describe are really interesting, very stereotype consistent, but they're still very positive and seems to be effective. So I'll talk today about one study and a little bit about another that details and uses this imagined interaction with atheists. So this is the intervention that we use. So you can see the description there. Please spend the next 3 minutes imagining that you are meeting someone for the first time who is an atheist. Imagine that the interaction is relaxed, positive, and comfortable. You spend about 30 minutes talking and learn some interesting and unexpected things about them. And the control condition is just to please think about atheists for the next 3 minutes, and some of those responses are what I showed you at the beginning of the talk. I want to mention real quickly that this description, for those of you familiar with imagined intergroup contact work, this description is much more detailed than what is currently recommended by Turner and Chris. What they say is they started out with really detailed recommendations, but they learned to sort of pare it back, and as long as you say you have a positive interaction, people tend to have them. And imagine this, so there's much more variability in their experiences, and so that sort of lends some richness to it. However, I tried that first, and if you tell people just to have an interaction with an atheist and you just use the word positive, I think there were 2 out of the 140 or so that were actually positive. Instead, they were incredibly stereotype consistent. So I think given the nature of the group as a concealable stigma, people thought, how do I know this person is an atheist? Well, it's because they're arrogant and arguing with me. Right, and that's how they were described. And it was really, I looked at those data and thought, this is really interesting, but it's not the effect I'm looking for. So I'm going to put that away for a little while and design a slightly different manipulation that actually required and asked them to focus on the relaxing and the communal aspects of their interaction. After that, they spend the next 3 minutes listing as many things as they can about that imagined interaction or describing the thoughts that they had. So this is a Mechanical Turk study. We sampled 351 participants from Mechanical Turk. 66 or 19% of that sample self-identified as atheists and were subsequently removed from analyses. Although I think there's some interesting stuff in the imagined interactions with in-group members as well, and I'll look at that at some point. But the resulting sample was 285 people, which conveniently were 50% women, with a slightly older age than we typically get in college populations and more variable. I'll just mention this aside for those of you not terribly familiar with Mechanical Turk. It's a more representative sample than a college sample, but it shouldn't be construed as a nationally representative sample. There are certainly lots of problems with MTurk samples as well. But this is one of the things that I think is really important to understanding intergroup bias towards atheists, is that people don't think they have contact with them. So this is that MTurk sample, and what we're finding here is that 53% plus of the sample reported having no or very few interpersonal contacts who are atheists. Only 7% indicated that more than half of their contact were atheists. Contact with atheists differed by participant self-identification as agnostic or theists, right, such that theists had less contact, or reported less contact with atheists than agnostics. So the question is, does imagined interaction reduce distrust? So what we did is a series of mean comparisons here, where you can see the blue bar is the imagined interaction condition and the red bar is the control condition, and on the y-axis you see the mean Likert item for each of these subscales of allophilia here, and beginning with distrust. And so what you can see is that for distrust, people in the imagined interaction condition were significantly lower, significantly less less distrust than those in the control condition. And there was an overall effect for allophilia, but again, this is being driven by comfort and engagement. And comfort is how comfortable are you interacting with this group, and engagement is how willing are you to communicate with members of this group, right? And so it looks like this imagined interaction is having an effect precisely where more intergroup contact might be possible, right? And sort of a valuable first step towards engaging with folks and sort of breaking those stereotype consistent descriptions. So we were curious whether or not the imagined interaction was going to be capable of pushing around atheist distrust, right, and reducing distrust, since we know that that's the one that's most likely to respond here. So this is multiple regression predicting distrust in this case, and so you can see that the condition dummy-coded here was a significant predictor, as was fundamentalism and authoritarianism in this particular case. Such that those in the, well, I'll show you some figures in a minute, but those in the imagined interaction condition had significantly distrust even when controlling for fundamentalism and authoritarianism. And then we're also looking at allophilia, and so this is the overall allophilia measure. And you can see the condition again had a significant effect where fundamentalism, and then we've included distrust in this model as well. So even among those who are very distrusting, even among those who are fundamentalist, the condition is still having a significant effect at sort of reducing those, or increasing the positive attitudes, particularly in engagement and comfort. When predicting distrust, there was a main effect for condition and fundamentalism, and the interaction between fundamentalism and condition was not significant. So this is pretty similar to what you saw in the first non-experimental study, where you're going to see high fundamentalism is associated with more distrust. But in the imagined condition, you see a main effect there where whether they're low or high in fundamentalism, they're less than their control counterparts. This pattern persisted and actually strengthened a bit when removing agnostics from the sample and just looking at those who were theists and said they believed in God. Here's where the interaction lies. So when predicting positive attitudes, I'm trying to predict allophilia, in this case, fundamentalism consistently interacted with the condition. It did not, I'm not going to show you the rest of those interactions, it didn't interact with distrust, distrust didn't interact with the condition, and the three-way interaction was insignificant. But even among fundamentalists, what you're seeing here, even among those high in fundamentalism, atheist allophilia was increased by the imagined condition, and in fact this interaction is significant, and such that those with low fundamentalism really didn't have a lot of place to move, right? They were already fairly high, in particular, this is comfort, so this is the strongest effect. So particularly in comfort, low fundamentalists were already pretty comfortable engaging in conversations with these folks, but after the imagined condition you see a pretty big dip. So you may be sort of asking, what did they imagine? Why? What is the thing that worked? And that was my question as we look at these data, like what is it about these imagined interactions that's being effective? And so I've got a few here, actually I'm going to show you. This one's probably the most valuable. I'll just read it real quick. At first I was a little bit nervous meeting with this person who was an atheist because I'm a very strong Christian and I knew that our beliefs would contradict very much. As we sat down and talked, I realized that I was comfortable around them and it was better than I thought it would, assuming be. I asked them questions about their faith and they were able to tell me their thoughts and beliefs. Even though I was comfortable, I still felt a little uneasy. They did tell me some things I didn't know about their faith. Even though I still remained strong and moral in my faith and religion, I didn't shut out what they had to say. I felt that everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their opinions. And this was somebody that was pretty high in fundamentalism. I selected for folks that were in the top third, and these are the kinds of things that we got from them. At first I was skeptical of sharing personal thoughts or views of this person. After a few minutes, she began to discuss things that were relevant to me. Did believe she was passionate about her personal experiences, at the same time believed that she was missing something, possibly her belief in God. Did not agree with all of her moral and social views, but for the most part we were similar. She definitely made me think about my own beliefs, made me feel grateful I believed in God, had a spiritual connection. That was something she could not understand. Every one of these I read sort of blows my mind, how rich and varied the experiences are. I really didn't expect the imagined interaction to have this kind of effect. And what we're finding is that effect persists, and we're in, I guess we've done phase 2 of a longitudinal study where they're asked to do this somewhat repeatedly and seeing how those attitudes change over time. And it's very preliminary data, but we're seeing that trend over time, that distrust drops off pretty quickly and stays low over time, even after the interaction, or what we're about to see, I hope, is that after the imagined interactions have stopped, that effect persists over time. You don't have to keep imagining in that case. So, really, the fundamentalism is a critical predictor here, and that's one of the contributions, I think, of this particular set of studies, is that not only does distrust matter, the basic worldview of the people who hold that trust or distrust is still a critical component that needs to be understood, especially in interventions to reduce the effects of that stigma. So what we know, just based on looking at the studies, is that if we can get people to imagine members of another group, that's going to lead to more integrated and more purposeful contact in the future. Thank you so much. Yeah, Julie.
Jordan, do you have any evidence that people who wrote more elaborate stories, or like any sort of index of how engaged they got in this imaginary process that they were going through, if people who had a more elaborate experience had bigger changes in their attitudes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was just talking with Eric and a couple of people about now having all this qualitative data that I have no skills or training to deal with. But they have colleagues who are really interested in this stuff, and we've started pursuing some of that. Annie, one of the students that I mentioned previously, is currently content coding all of that stuff, and vividness is one of the things that we're coding for there. It turns out that, surprising, if they didn't just completely fail the manipulation check, if they did it, it tended to be quite vivid. They described physical sensations. I was sitting there, I felt this, it was a lot of weather talk. And I was really surprised because I thought people would have a hard time. And some did, and one of the things we're going to look at is whether they were able to figure out how it was disclosed that they were an atheist, because I had a lot of people saying, how did I know this person was an atheist without them telling me? Right, and so were they wearing a atheist necklace? So there was a lot of discussion about things like that. But yeah, we're looking at that. I think vividness is a big part of it. I think that actually, and Turner and Crisp have suggested that imagining the experience itself is important.
I also wonder about people, whether they were actually talking about religion, as opposed to just connecting about something that wasn't going to bring up their differences.
That we have looked at, and let's see, among agnostics, conversations about religion had less effect. But among theists, as long as they were positive, as long as they passed the manipulation check, there was no difference between whether they were talking about religion or not. But again, you saw what some of those conversations about religion looked like. They were very positive and happy and cuddly, instead of argumentative.
I can also imagine, atheists are not monolithic, just like any
Right.
group. So imagining sitting down and having a conversation with Richard Dawkins is going to be different than imagining sitting down and having a conversation with not Richard Dawkins. But I wonder if for a theist, imagining Richard Dawkins as a positive person might be more challenging than just...
I think that's true, and actually Charles, one of the students, suggested that we do another condition where we give them an identified atheist, and give them, that's going to channel all that stereotype, right? Right. I mean, it's just going to sort of reinforce that. But I think it would be interesting to see. You did see a lot of that, right? They sort of identifying that particular argumentative, you're stupid. There was actually one. I may have put it on here in another slide, but I wonder if they think I'm dumb. That was one of the ideas, and that persisted. There was a lot of this sort of intellectualism stereotype.
It might be also interesting, given that you live in Maine with a lot of atheists, to imagine theists having a conversation with them.
Yeah, we've talked about that too. Given the cultural prevalence of most of our atheists are apostates, right? So they come from a church background, and so I'm curious. Yeah, I am curious what kinds of reactions we might get if people are asked to imagine that kind of interaction. Yeah.
With your first batch that you said came out not positive, how much did you see evangelizing?
That's funny.
Yeah, I had a really good positive interaction, which actually means I converted the batch.
Yeah, I haven't systematically looked at those data, so I can't tell you anything with certainty, but there certainly is some of that in there. More of it actually is that, again, not systematic analysis, but it looks like a lot of it is them feeling like they're being proselytized to by the atheist. They're trying to convert me away, and viewing them more as a threat than as themselves as a ability.
I did a similar thing where I would ask them I'd ask Christians what an atheist is, and I often read, I feel bad for atheists.
Oh yeah, lots of
Did you
pity.
read a lot of
Lots
that?
of pity.
Yeah.
They're missing something, like we saw in that, right? They're missing this particular thing. Yeah. Yes, there's a lot in there. Mm.
I'm not sure if you're able to answer this question, but have you thought about maybe having atheists imagine theists?
Yeah, and I think that would be really interesting. We have a lot of atheists, but I'm saying that relative to my several years at Baylor, where there aren't a lot of atheists. So I think getting a sizable sample of them would be a little bit challenging, but I think it's a good idea. We may be able to selectively recruit them on InTurk, right? Just say it.
Which is, we just did that.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'd like to hear about that. Yeah.
So with the Imagine in group contact, do you have control over the positive experience versus not? And given some of the consequences that you were talking about that could come from real, do you think that these benefits would still persist in actual in-group contact? Or is this just good to reduce prejudice? What happens when they're actually together?
When they actually interact, that's great. So we don't know with atheists, but there's some pretty good data from Turner and Crisp indicating that imagined interaction promotes more positive real interactions. I don't know of any that uses it with a concealable group, but I bet it exists. But that might be particularly interesting because you don't know when that's going to happen. You can't prepare for it mentally. You can't, So, but yeah, I think that's part of it.
Let me thank Jordan for presenting. I don't know if you noticed, but they really did take all of our food and drink. But there will be food and drink immediately after this.